They called it a trial. I had seen enough of Earth's history to know what it really was. A room full of people who had never lost anything, deciding what I should have been willing to lose. My name is Yael Dresch. I am 39 years old. I grew up in a city that used to flood every other spring. In a country that had spent 3 centuries learning how to argue its way out of corners it could not shoot its way out of. I became a diplomat not because I was soft, but because I was the kind of person who could sit completely still while someone said something deeply wrong and wait, just wait, for exactly the right moment to respond. That skill had never mattered more than the morning I walked alone into the Galactic Conclave's central chamber on station, Vareth 9, carrying nothing but a data case and 47 years of human stubbornness in my blood. The station was enormous. Everything the Conclave built was enormous. Because the Conclave was 31 species spread across 900 light-years, and enormous things made them feel important. The ceilings in the central chamber rose to something like 60 meters. The delegates' seats were arranged in a perfect arc, tiered like an ancient amphitheater, and every seat was filled. 31 species. Hundreds of eyes, some of them literal eyes like mine, some of them sensory clusters, some of them light-reading organs that had no human equivalent. All of them were looking at me. I was the only human in the room. Earth had sent no warships, no escort fleet, no honor guard or protective detail. The decision had been deliberate, made at the highest level of Earth's diplomatic corps, and I had agreed with it completely. We wanted the image to be clear. It's a single woman, walking in alone, sitting down calmly, ready to speak. It said something that a convoy of warships could not. It said we were not afraid of their words. I found my seat at the respondents' table, a low, flat surface positioned in the open center of the arc, surrounded on all sides by the tiered delegate seats. In a human courtroom, the respondent sits across from the judge. Here, the respondent sat in the middle, encircled. The design was intentional. It was meant to feel like pressure. I set my data case on the table and folded my hands and looked around the room slowly, making eye contact, or the alien equivalent, with as many delegates as I could. I did not smile. I was not hostile. I was simply present, in the way that a mountain is present, quietly, without apology. The presiding elder of the conclave was a Kelvori, species whose members lived for approximately 400 standard years and carried themselves accordingly. His name was Councillor Breveth. He was ancient by any measure, and he had the manner of someone who had never once been surprised by anything that happened in this chamber. He had been surprised today, though. I could tell by the slight stillness in his secondary tendrils, a Kelvori tell I had spent 2 years studying. He had expected Earth to send someone apologetic. He cleared his vocal membrane and opened the session. This convening of the Galactic Conclave is called to adjudicate the matter of Case 11-7 Alpha, he said in unified standard, the trade language all 31 species used in formal settings. The matter concerns actions taken by the government and armed forces of the planet Earth within the jurisdiction of the Kepler Reach against registered vessels of the Veth Dominion. The formal charge is unprovoked military aggression, in violation of Conclave Charter Article 14, Sections 2 and 5. He paused. Every eye in the room moved to me. I said nothing. Breveth continued. The respondent representative, Commander Yael Dresch of Earth's Diplomatic Corps, has been summoned to answer these charges formally before this body. The Veth Dominion has filed the complaint. Evidence has been submitted to the record. This body will hear the complaint, hear the response, and render judgment. He looked at me with those ancient tired eyes. Commander Dresch, do you understand the charges as stated? I do, I said. My voice was calm. It was always calm in rooms like this. My mother had once told me that the most dangerous thing a person could be in an argument was calm, because calm meant you had already thought further ahead than the person across from you. My mother had been a union organizer in Birmingham for 30 years. She knew something about rooms where the odds were stacked against you. And how does Earth respond? I looked at the Veth ambassador across the chamber. His name was Veth Kree Soland, and he was one of the Dominion's senior diplomatic voices, a tall, smooth-skinned being with 4 articulated fingers on each hand, and the expression of someone who had already written the conclusion to today's story, and was just waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. I looked back at Breveth. Earth is prepared to respond fully, I said, but I would request that the complaint be presented in its entirety before I do. I want this chamber to hear everything the Veth Dominion considers relevant, all of it, with no interruption from my side. There was a murmur through the chamber. Several delegates shifted in their seats. Breveth tilted his head slightly. That is an unusual request from a respondent. I have my reasons, I said. He studied me for a moment. Then he nodded. As you wish. Ambassador Solond, please present the Dominion's complaint in full. Solond rose smoothly. He was gracious about it. He had every reason to be gracious. From where he was standing, this was going to be easy. I sat back in my chair and listened. I let my expression stay neutral. I breathed slowly. I watched every delegate in the tiered arc, reading their body language, noting who leaned forward with interest, who sat back with discomfort, who exchanged small glances with their neighbors. And I waited. Because the thing about being in a room full of people who have already decided the outcome is that they always talk too long. They get comfortable. They say more than they need to. They assume the other side has nothing real to offer, and that assumption makes them careless. Solond spoke for 41 minutes. By the time he finished, I knew exactly where every delegate in that chamber stood, and I had revised my approach 3 times. The Veth Dominion's case was, on its surface, clean and simple. 3 Veth vessels had been destroyed in the Kepler Reach. Earth's defense fleet had fired first. 37 Veth crew members had died. Earth had offered no prior diplomatic warning, no formal ultimatum, and had not invoked any conclave conflict protocol before acting. Under Article 14, Sections 2 and 5, unprovoked first-strike military action against a member species was a sanctionable offense. The Veth were requesting sanctions, a mandatory ceasefire, and the formal cession of the disputed Kepler Reach territory to Dominion administration as appropriate reparation. It was a clean case. It was a case built entirely on what had happened in a single afternoon in the Kepler Reach, with no context before it and no questions asked about the years that had led to that afternoon. Solond sat down looking satisfied. Breveth turned to me. Earth may now respond. I stood up. I picked up my data case. I walked to the center display column, connected the case, and turned to face the chamber. Before I say a single word in response, I said, I want to ask this chamber one question. I want an honest answer, and I want it from any delegate who feels comfortable giving it. The chamber was quiet. In the 41 minutes that Ambassador Solond just spoke, he described the afternoon of the 14th of March in the Kepler Reach. He described it in detail. He named the ships, he named the crew. He gave coordinates and timestamps and impact angles. I paused. Did any delegate in this chamber, any one of you, wonder what happened on the 13th of March, or the 12th, or in the 843 days before that afternoon? Silence. One delegate, from a species called the Durathi, small and gray-feathered with quick, bright eyes, shifted in her speak. But she shifted, that was enough. I thought so, I said. Let me tell you about the 843 days. Because that is where the actual story begins. I brought up the first file. The chamber's main display lit up with a map of the Kepler Reach, the stretch of border land space where Earth's outer colonies had been slowly, quietly strangled for 2.5 years. I submitted 847 pages of documentation to this chamber 6 weeks ago, I said. I want to make sure everyone here knows that, because the documentation is in the record. Every number I am about to give you is sourced, dated, and verifiable. I looked slowly around the arc of delegates. 843 days ago, the Veth Dominion began what I am going to call a patience campaign. They did not fire weapons. They did not send warships into human space. They did nothing that would trigger a single clause in the Conclave's charter. Instead, they did something much more careful. I clicked to the next display. They started disappearing our ships. The room went very still. I had their attention now. All of it. The disappearances had begun small. A single cargo hauler on the Kepler 4 route, reported overdue and then simply never found. A communications relay station on the outer edge of the Reach, which went offline one Tuesday and never came back. 2 survey ships, registered to a private Earth contractor, which had filed departure logs from Kepler 9 and never filed arrival logs anywhere. Every time, Earth filed a formal query with the Conclave's Regional Oversight Office. Every time the query was logged, assigned a case number, and placed in a review queue. Every time the review produced the same conclusion: insufficient evidence of Dominion involvement. Recommend monitoring. Monitoring. As if monitoring would feed the families of the crew members who had gone missing. I stood in front of the conclave chamber and walked them through it methodically. Every disappearance, every query, every dismissal. I did not raise my voice. I did not use language designed to make them feel accused. I simply laid the facts down in sequence, one after another, the way you lay stones to build a wall. And I let the wall build itself. The Veth trade blockade had started in month 4. It was not called a blockade. Officially, it was a series of navigational safety advisories issued by Dominion Traffic Control, recommending that commercial vessels avoid certain corridors in the Reach due to uncharted debris fields. The advisories were updated every 2 weeks, always expanding, always shifting just enough to keep Earth's legal team from filing a clean complaint. The Conclave's trade division had reviewed the advisories twice and found them to be within acceptable parameters. The colonies in the outer reach had begun to feel the shortage in month 6. Not a dramatic shortage, nothing that made headlines, nothing that photographs could capture easily. Just the slow, grinding kind, medical supplies running low, replacement parts for water filtration units taking 4 times longer to arrive, children's nutrition supplements that used to come every 3 weeks now coming every 11. Earth had filed 14 formal complaints with the Conclave Trade Division over 18 months. 11 had been dismissed for insufficient evidence of intent. 2 had been tabled pending further review. 1 had been forwarded to a subcommittee, which had met 3 times and produced a recommendation that the Conclave encourage all parties to seek bilateral dialogue. Encourage. I remember reading that word in the subcommittee report and sitting with it for a long time. I remember thinking about the water filtration units. I remember thinking about what it means to encourage dialogue while children in the outer colonies rationed water. In month 19, I told the chamber, the disappearances changed in character. They became faster, less careful. A colony shuttle was intercepted 20 kilometers inside undisputed Earth space. The crew of 9 was never recovered. Veth Dominion transponder residue was found at the site by an Earth survey team. We submitted that evidence to the Conclave's security division. I pulled up the document on the main display. The chamber could see it clearly, the survey report, the spectrographic analysis, the Dominion transponder signature. The security division concluded that the evidence was suggestive but not conclusive, and recommended against escalating the matter to a formal censure proceeding. I let that sit in the air for a moment. 9 crew members, I said. Suggestive but not conclusive. The Dorothi delegate, the small, quick-eyed one who had shifted in her seat during my opening, was now leaning forward with both elbows on her console. She was watching me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone putting pieces together that they had not previously thought to connect. I continued. By month 22, the outer colonies were in genuine distress. Not a crisis that could be broadcast on a newsfeed in a clean, dramatic image. The slow kind of crisis, the kind that grinds people down over months until they are exhausted and frightened and not entirely sure whether the thing happening to them is intentional or simply bad luck. That uncertainty is a tool. The Veth had used it with considerable skill. The colonial governors had sent increasingly urgent messages to Earth's government. Earth's government had sent increasingly urgent messages to the Conclave. The Conclave had continued to review, to monitor, to table, to encourage. The Kepler-7 colony had begun water rationing in month 23, a colony of 42,000 people. Children in schools, elderly residents in medical care facilities, water rationing. I did not describe the rationing in graphic terms. I did not need to. I simply stated it, with the date and the population number and the duration, and I let every delegate in the chamber do the human calculation themselves, or whatever version of that calculation their species ran when they heard that a community of 42,000 had started measuring how much water their children could drink. In month 24, I said, Earth's Colonial Defense Force received intelligence from a source I am not at liberty to name in open session, but which is fully documented in the classified annex of our submission, indicating that the Veth Dominion was preparing to move a formal expansion fleet into the Kepler Reach. Not a patrol, not a survey mission, an expansion fleet, with colonization infrastructure and administrative personnel. I paused. At that point, Earth's government made a decision. They had spent 2 years filing complaints, submitting evidence, and receiving polite letters explaining why the evidence was insufficient. They had watched 42,000 people ration water. They had counted 9 missing crew members whose families still had no answers. They had filed queries with 6 different conclave divisions and been told to seek bilateral dialogue. I looked at Soland. He was watching me with an expression that had begun to change. He had walked into this chamber expecting a defensive response, an apology wrapped in justification, a plea for leniency, perhaps as an offer of reparations. He had not expected this. Earth's government decided, I said quietly, that the conclave's process had been given every reasonable opportunity to protect its newest member, and that it had chosen, repeatedly and consistently, not to do so. I looked back at the chamber. On the 14th of March, when 3 Veth Dominion vessels entered the Kepler Reach on a heading consistent with the advanced positioning of the expansion fleet, Earth's Colonial Defense Force intercepted them. Warnings were issued. The vessels did not alter course. The vessels were removed from the equation. I said it exactly like that, removed from the equation. Not because I was trying to hide what had happened, but because the clinical language was more honest than the dramatic version. It had been a military action, executed by soldiers following orders, in defense of a community that had been quietly suffering for 2 years, while the appropriate authorities looked the other way. 37 crew members died, I said. I want to be direct about that. I do not celebrate it. I do not pretend it was a small thing. Those were living beings, and they are gone, and that matters. I paused. It is also the first death count I have given you today that the Veth Dominion is willing to put in front of this chamber. Every other number, the missing ships, the 9 crew members, the 42,000 people rationing water, those numbers were not on Ambassador Solon's display. The chamber was very quiet. Breveth, who had been still as a statue throughout my entire presentation, slowly turned his ancient eyes toward the Veth ambassador. Solon was no longer looking satisfied. I had more to say, but I let the silence work for a moment, because some things land harder in silence than in words, and I had learned that the hard way in enough negotiation rooms to know exactly when to stop talking. The chamber breathed, and waited, and I reached into my data case for the second file. I am now going to show you, I said, what Ambassador Solon did not. I brought up the display. It was not more colony data, it was not more missing ships or water rationing reports. It was something else entirely. Something that had not been part of my original case file. Something that Earth's Intelligence Division had quietly handed me 3 days before I boarded the transport to Varath 9. 6 fleet positions. Active Veth Dominion staging coordinates. Not in human space, in the space of 6 other Conclave member species. The chamber did not go quiet this time. The chamber erupted. In 6 languages simultaneously, with the translation overlays creating a layered roar, rose from the tiered seats. Delegates leaned forward, several stood. The Durathi delegate's hand went to her communications console and then stopped, because she was in a formal session and she knew she could not make a call from here, and that helplessness was written clearly on her face. I waited. Breveth struck the session tone, a low, resonant sound that carried through the entire chamber. 3 times before the noise settled back to something manageable. Explain this, he said to me. His voice was very flat. The Veth Dominion tested their patience campaign on Earth, I said, because Earth was the right target. We are the newest member of this conclave. We have the fewest connections, the fewest allies, the least political weight. If the campaign worked on us, if we conceded the Kepler reach quietly, or if we responded and were sanctioned for it, the Dominion would have a proven method and a legal precedent. I looked around the chamber slowly. This is not speculation. These fleet positions are real. The coordinates are in your record. 3 of those fleets are positioned near species in this room right now. I let that sentence finish. I did not point at anyone. I did not name names. I let every delegate in the chamber do the calculation themselves. 3 fleets, 6 species within range. Every delegate doing the quiet, cold arithmetic of working out whether their territory was in the window. You assaulted Earth, I said. And while you were busy debating whether we fought back correctly, they have been watching to see if it worked. Solon was on his feet. His voice was controlled but tight. This is fabricated intelligence. This is a deflection tactic by a species attempting to escape accountability for a clear violation of, the coordinates are in the record, I said simply. Verify them, Commander Dresch, Breveth said. And his voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Something careful. Something that was not quite uncertainty but was the sound of a very old, very composed mind suddenly aware that the ground had shifted. These fleet positions, when were they acquired? 11 days ago, I said, before I left Earth. And you brought them here. I brought them here, I confirmed. Because this chamber is where decisions affecting this entire region of space are supposed to be made. I believed you deserved to make them with full information. I paused. I still believe that, even though the last 2 years have given me reasons to be less confident about it than I once was. That landed. I saw it land on Breveth's face first, then ripple outward through the chamber in the way that honest things sometimes do when they arrive in rooms that have been running on comfortable assumptions for a long time. I did not come here to escape accountability, I said. I came here to give this body the chance to do what it should have done 20 months ago. If you want to hold Earth accountable for the 14th of March, I will sit here and accept whatever judgment this chamber produces. But I will not accept it quietly, and I will not accept it without making sure that every delegate in this room understands the full shape of what they are deciding. I sat back down. Breveth called a recess, 15 minutes, then 30, then another 20 on top of that. I sat at the respondents' table and drank the water that a young conclave aide, barely an adult by her species measure, with the nervous energy of someone who had never seen a session go this far off script, had quietly placed in front of me. I did not check my communications. I did not review my notes. I sat and breathed and thought about Kepler-7 and the 42,000 people who had rationed water while the appropriate authorities filed their queries and tabled their recommendations. When the chamber reconvened, the shape of the room had changed, not physically, the same seats, the same arc, the same 60-meter ceilings. But the energy was different. 3 delegations had clearly been communicating during the recess. I could see it in the slight synchronization of their postures, the way their aides had moved to sit closer to them. 2 others had drawn inward, gone quiet in a way that had less to do with neutrality, and more to do with the look of organizations urgently recalculating their position. And the Veth ambassador was still standing. He had been standing, I realized, for most of the recess period, standing and speaking in a low, rapid voice to 2 aides who were relaying messages on handheld units. He had the air of a person who had arrived at a party, expecting to give a pleasant speech and had discovered halfway through the room that someone else had rearranged all the furniture. Breveth settled into his chair with the deliberate care of someone who was very old and very tired, and had not expected his afternoon to become historically significant. He looked at me. "Commander Dresch," he said, "I have one question before I open the floor to delegate response." "Of course," I said. Did Earth know when it acted on the 14th of March that it would be summoned here? The question was precise. He was not asking whether Earth expected consequences. He was asking something sharper, whether this entire sequence had been planned, whether the trial was part of the strategy. I looked at him for a moment. "Yes," I said. Another wave of murmuring through the chamber, quickly stilled. "Earth knew the conclave's charter," I continued. "We knew that any military action would trigger a formal complaint from the Veth Dominion. We knew that complaint would result in this summons. We chose to act anyway, not because we were reckless, but because we had concluded, after 2 years of evidence, that the only way to bring the full picture into this chamber was to give this chamber a reason to convene." I paused. If we had continued filing complaints quietly, the Dominion's expansion fleet would have entered the Reach in approximately 6 weeks. There would have been no trial, because there would have been no incident. Just a slow territorial transfer that everyone would have called a political development rather than what it actually was. Breveth was quiet for a long moment. "You use this chamber," he said. "I use this chamber the way it was designed to be used." I said, "I brought evidence, I presented facts, I asked for a judgment. The fact that the evidence was inconvenient does not make the chamber's purpose wrong. It makes the chamber's history of avoiding that purpose the problem we should be examining." That was the most direct I had been. I watched Breveth's reaction carefully. He was quiet, but he was not offended. He was, and this surprised me slightly, something closer to thoughtful. "The floor is open to delegate response," he said. What followed was not an orderly proceeding. The Durathi delegate spoke first, rapidly, and with the clipped urgency of someone who had spent the recess running numbers. She confirmed that Durathi territory sat within the range of 2 of the 6 fleet positions I had displayed. She wanted immediate verification of the coordinates. She wanted a security subcommittee convened by end of day. 3 other delegates followed with variations of the same demand. One of them, a Malveth senior counselor with the measured, formal tone of a species that had been in the conclave for 200 years, said something quietly devastating. He noted that his own government had filed 3 complaints about Dominion activity near their borders over the past 18 months and had received the same language Earth had received. Insufficient evidence, bilateral dialogue encouraged. He said it without looking at Solond. He did not need to. Solond rose twice to object, once to challenge the authenticity of the fleet position data, which Breveth acknowledged and referred to the Technical Verification Division, once to argue that Earth's deliberate provocation of an incident should be treated as an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. On the second objection, a delegate I had not expected, a Crescent representative, a species I had always understood to be closely aligned with the Veth Dominion economically, said quietly that she was not certain the provocation argument held weight given the evidence of sustained prior action. Solond looked at the Crescent delegate the way a person looks at a foundation they thought was solid when it cracks under their feet. I said nothing. I had made my case. I had laid the wall, stone by stone, and now I sat and watched the chamber come to terms with what it was looking at. The session went on for another 2 hours. In that time, the original charges against Earth were formally moved to a review period. Not dismissed, but suspended pending verification of the intelligence data and a fuller review of the complaint record over the preceding 24 months. More significantly, Delegate Councillor Marin of the Durathi, the small, quick-eyed delegate who had shifted in her seat at my very first question, introduced a formal motion. It proposed the establishment of a review committee to examine what the motion called the doctrine of documented slow harm, the legal gap in the conclave's charter that allowed gradual, sustained damage to a member species to fall below the threshold of actionable grievance. The motion passed on a preliminary vote, not unanimously. 7 delegates voted against, including 2 whose abstention I had predicted and 1 whose vote against genuinely surprised me. But it passed. It would take years to produce a real result. These things always did. A committee would meet. A subcommittee would form from the committee. Reports would be written and reviewed and revised. The actual reform of Article 14 could be a decade away. But it had begun, today, in this chamber, because Earth had been patient for 2 years, then refused to be patient for 1 more day. When Breveth formally suspended the session, I gathered my data case and stood up slowly. My back ached in the way it always did after long sessions in formal seating. I was 39 years old and I felt every year of it. The conclave aide, the young one who had brought me water, appeared at my side. She said something in her native language before switching to Unified Standard, and the switch told me the native language version had been the honest one. That was, "I have not seen a session like that," she said. Her voice was careful, professional, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had just seen something they would think about for a long time, in 9 years working this chamber. "Let's hope the next one is quieter," I said, or did the equivalent of smiling, a slight brightening of the sensory clusters around her eyes. "I do not think it will be." I walked toward the chamber exit. Before I reached the door, I felt a presence at my left and turned. It was the Crescent delegate, the one who had quietly undermined Solon's second objection. She was shorter than me by a full head and she moved with the economical precision of a species that did not waste motion. She did not introduce herself. She did not extend the formal greeting her species used in official settings. She just looked at me for a moment with eyes that were the color of deep amber and said, very quietly, "We have had concerns for 14 months. We did not know how to raise them without making a certain relationship more complicated than we could manage." I understood exactly what she was telling me. "The review committee is a good place to start," I said. She nodded once, quickly, and walked away in the other direction. I stood in the corridor outside the chamber and breathed for a moment. The station's environmental systems kept the air at a temperature that worked for 12 of the 31 species and was mildly uncomfortable for the rest. I was in the mildly uncomfortable category. I had been for every hour I had spent on this station. I looked out through the corridor's observation panel at the stars. They did not look different. They never did. They were just stars. The same ones that humans had been looking at from rooftops and shorelines and mountaintops for as long as humans had been capable of looking up and wondering. We had been reaching toward them for a long time before we actually got here, and getting here had not made it simpler. It had just made the distances feel more real, and the stakes feel more immediate. I thought about Kepler-7. I thought about the 42,000 people who had rationed water for 8 months. I thought about the 9 crew members whose families still did not have answers. I thought about the 2 young soldiers in the Colonial Defense Force who had fired the first shots on the 14th of March, and who were, right now, back on their ship somewhere in the Reach, probably wondering what was happening in this chamber. I would send word tonight, not through official channels. Those would take a week to clear the conclave's communications protocols. Through a private relay, a brief personal message. "It is going the right way." It was not a victory. I did not call it that, even inside my own head, because calling it a victory would have been both premature and inaccurate. The charges had not been dropped. The review committee was a beginning, not an end. The Veth Dominion's fleet positions were still real, and the Dominion was still powerful, and the 14 months the Crescent delegate had mentioned were 14 months of concerns left unspoken, which meant the problem was bigger than one afternoon in the Kepler Reach. But the room had changed. The chamber had looked at the full picture, maybe for the first time in this situation, and it had not looked away. That was enough to work with. I picked up my data case and began walking toward the communications center to file my report. I had a lot to say. I had been awake for 31 hours by the time I finished my initial report to Earth's diplomatic corps. I sent it on the secure channel, encrypted to the level that only 3 people in the corps could open it without a decryption team. And then I sat in the small quarters that the conclave station assigned to visiting representatives and stared at the ceiling for a while. The quarters were functional and impersonal, the way all institutional rooms are, with materials chosen for durability, rather than comfort, and walls that were a shade of pale gray-green that probably meant something pleasant to at least one of the 31 species but read as clinical to me. There was a sleeping surface, a desk, a sanitation unit, and a narrow window that looked out on the station's interior atrium rather than open space. The atrium was full of the kind of ambient light that stations maintain to simulate a day cycle, even this late in the local schedule. I should have slept. I knew I should have slept. My body was telling me with considerable emphasis that 31 hours was long enough, and that the next phase of whatever this was going to become would benefit from me being rested. My brain was not ready to stop. I pulled up the full record of the session on my personal display and went through it again. Not the substance, which I knew as well as I knew my own name, but the reactions, the delegate responses, the timing of who spoke and who stayed quiet and who moved to their communications consoles the moment Breveth called recess. Politics, my first instructor at the diplomatic corps had told me, is not about what people say. It is about what they do in the 3 seconds after someone says something unexpected. I had been watching those 3 seconds all day. The Veth Dominion had miscalculated. That was the first thing. They had built their case on the assumption that Earth would respond defensively, that we would acknowledge the 14th of March, offer some form of regret, and argue for reduced sanctions. That response would have been easy to manage. It would have confirmed the Dominion's narrative. Humanity was impulsive, reactive, willing to use force but ultimately dependent on the Conclave's goodwill for protection. A chastened Earth, accepting a territorial concession, and a formal full censure, would have been exactly the kind of outcome that made the Patience campaign worth running, again on the next target. Instead, Earth had done something the Dominion had not modeled. We had told the whole story, not just our piece of it. The whole story, including the parts that pointed outward, the parts that made other species in that chamber realize they were not observers at a trial about humanity. They were potential future respondents at a trial about themselves. That reframing was the core of everything. Once the delegates understood that the Veth's strategy was not specifically about Earth, but about finding the weakest point in the conclaves, membership and pressing it until it gave way. Once they understood that Earth had simply been the experiment, the entire chamber's relationship, the case changed. They were no longer judging whether Earth had broken the rules. They were deciding whether the rules were being used against them. I had seen that shift happen in the chamber, and watching it had been like watching water find a new path. The moment the first delegate turned her eyes from the respondent's table toward the Veth ambassador and began calculating distance rather than guilt, that was the moment the session became something other than what Solent had planned. He had planned a verdict. He had gotten a reckoning. There was a soft chime from my communications panel. I looked over. The identifier was from within the station, not an outside channel, not Earth, not any of the formal conclave networks. A personal relay code, the kind used for informal station communications between delegates and their teams. The message was 3 lines. Commander Dresch, I represent a group of delegates who would find it useful to speak with you privately before session reconvenes tomorrow. We are not in formal alignment with each other, and this meeting would not be on the record. If you are willing, we can meet in the secondary conference suite on level 7 at the 7th hour. We understand if you decline. No name, no species identifier. Just the relay code, which I could trace if I wanted to. But the deliberate anonymity told me more than a name would have. They were being careful. They had not yet decided how visible they wanted to be in whatever was forming. This was the stage where people test the water before stepping into it. They wanted to know what Earth's intentions were before they committed to being seen standing next to us. I understood that completely. I had no interest in making anyone uncomfortable. Comfortable allies are more reliable than reluctant ones. I typed a single word back, confirmed. Then I closed the display and lay back on the sleeping surface and told myself firmly that I was going to rest for 5 hours at minimum, because the meeting at level 7 would require me to be sharp. And being sharp on 31 hours of no sleep was a structural problem rather than a matter of willpower. I was asleep in 4 minutes. The level 7 conference suite was smaller than I expected. A round table with 8 seats, indirect lighting, no recording equipment that I could detect, and a view window that looked out on open space rather than the atrium. Someone had chosen the room deliberately. Open space views have a way of making conversation feel more honest. 7 delegates were waiting when I arrived. I recognized 4 of them from the chamber. The other 3 I had to identify by species: a Tarvan, a Seth, and a representative of a species I knew only as the Voran, who had been conclave members for 80 years and had a reputation for saying very little in public sessions but thinking a great deal in private. Durathi delegate Councillor Marin was there. She was the one who had introduced the motion. She was also, I realized as I sat down, the one who had sent the message. The relay code, when I had checked it that morning, had traced to a communication account registered to the Durathi delegation. She looked at me directly. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I said. "We want to be honest with you," she said. "This group does not have a collective agenda. We are here because we have individual concerns that yesterday's session made relevant in ways we were not expecting." She looked around the table. The other 6 delegates, some human adjacent in their expressions, some not, showed various degrees of the same careful alertness. The Voran representative, who had 3 sets of articulated limbs and a face that was not configured for mammalian-style emotional signaling, was nonetheless radiating a quality I had learned to read as focused attention. "We believe the fleet position data you presented is accurate," Marin continued. "Our own intelligence assets, and I say this carefully, have data points that are consistent with what you showed yesterday. Not identical, not as complete, but consistent." I said nothing. I let her continue. "The Veth Dominion has significant economic relationships with several member species, including some in this room. Those relationships complicate a direct response." She paused. "What is complicated to name directly in the open session is less complicated to discuss here." "I understand," I said. "What does this group want from Earth?" The directness surprised some of them, I could tell. They had expected me to be more indirect, more diplomatic in the classical sense. The kind of diplomatic where you circle the actual subject for 20 minutes before landing on it. Earth's diplomatic corps had trained me in the classical approach, and I used it when it was the right tool. In this room with these people, the right tool was different. Marin almost smiled. "That is a very Earth way to ask a question. We have a limited amount of time before the session reconvenes," I said. "I would rather use it well." She nodded. "2 things. First, we want to know whether Earth intends to push for a full security audit of Dominion fleet movements as part of the review committee's mandate. That level of audit would require a majority vote and would face strong opposition from Dominion-aligned members. Earth supports a full audit. I said we will vote for it and we will say so publicly, even knowing it will make the sanctions question more complicated for you. The sanctions question is already complicated, I said. A full audit is worth the complication. There was a brief exchange of glances around the table. Not the kind that signals doubt, the kind that signals the confirmation of something already suspected. "Second," Marin said, "Earth's intelligence on the fleet positions. We would like to understand how current it is and whether it is being updated." That was a more careful question. She was asking whether Earth had ongoing intelligence assets in Dominion space, which was a sensitive thing for a conclave member to ask another conclave member because it implied activities that the Charter did not formally authorize. I looked at her for a moment. "I can tell you that the data I presented yesterday reflects conditions as of 11 days ago," I said, "and that Earth's capacity to monitor its own security interests has improved significantly in the past 24 months. I paused. "We found that we needed to develop that capacity, given what the standard monitoring processes were producing." She understood exactly what I was saying. Would Earth be open to sharing updated information through a secure informal channel if the situation develops? Earth would be open to that, I said. The Tarvan delegate, who had not spoken yet, leaned forward slightly. He was a large being, broad and deliberate in his movements, and he had the quality of someone who chose his words as if each one had weight. "I want to say something directly," he said. "The motion that passed yesterday, the review committee, is a beginning, but the conclave moves slowly on structural matters. It has always moved slowly. That is partly by design and partly by inertia." He looked at me steadily. "What Earth did yesterday was necessary. But it has also made the Veth Dominion aware that their strategy has been exposed. The next step they take will not be slow and patient. I want to be certain Earth understands that." "We understand it," I said. "We understood it before we acted. And you acted anyway." "We acted because the alternative was watching the slow strategy work," I said. "An exposed strategy that doesn't work anymore is less dangerous than a working one, even if the exposure creates a short-term reaction." He considered that. Then he nodded, slowly, with the air of someone deciding they respected a position even if it made them nervous. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. By the end of it, I had a clearer picture of where the conclave's fault lines actually ran. which relationships were purely economic and therefore potentially movable, which were built on older agreements and therefore more fixed, which delegations were genuinely alarmed by the fleet positions, and which were alarmed but paralyzed by debt or dependency. Political landscapes are like physical ones. You cannot move through them effectively if you are only looking at the surface. You need to know where the ground is soft. I was beginning to know. When the session reconvened at the 10th hour, the atmosphere in the chamber was different in the way that a room is different after a night of rain. Same room, different air. The Veth Dominion's delegation had arrived early and arranged themselves with a precision that read as deliberate, as though physical positioning in the chamber could replace the rhetorical ground they had lost the previous day. Solond rose before Breveth had fully settled into his chair. The Veth Dominion wishes to address the chamber on the matter of the intelligence data presented by Commander Dresch, he said, specifically on its provenance and reliability. Breveth looked at him with the patience of someone 400 years old dealing with someone who had not yet learned when to stop. The Technical Verification Division has been running analysis since yesterday's recess, he said. Their preliminary finding will be presented in, he checked his console, 40 minutes. We will hear the Dominion's concerns after that report. Solon sat down. The technical verification report, when it came, was delivered by a small, precise conclave official named Dresic, who had the energy of someone who found raw data actively enjoyable. She presented the verification findings in clean, methodical language. The fleet position coordinates Earth had submitted were accurate, not approximately accurate, not within a margin of interpretive error. They were consistent with independent tracking data from 3 conclave monitoring stations that had not been cross-referenced with each other before. Dresic's team ran the comparison, she added, in the careful language of a technical professional who understood that their words were going to land, politically, that the monitoring station data had been available in the conclave's own system for the preceding 14 months. It had simply not been analyzed in a way that produced the pattern Earth's submission had revealed. 14 months. The same time frame the Crescent delegate had mentioned to me in the corridor. Available, not analyzed. I did not look at Solond when Dresic finished her report. I looked at Breveth. He was sitting very still with the expression of a person who has just been shown, gently and professionally, that the answer to a problem was in the filing cabinet the whole time. The session from that point was long and at times disorderly. The Dominion attempted 3 procedural challenges to the verification methodology. All 3 were addressed by Dresic with the unflappable certainty of someone whose data was simply correct and who had done this long enough to be comfortable with people arguing at it. A delegate from a species called the Mareth, I had them listed as Dominion-aligned in my notes, abstained from 2 of the procedural votes rather than supporting the Dominion's challenges, which was a small signal but a real one. The motion to expand the review committee's mandate to include a formal audit of fleet movement documentation was introduced by the Tarvan delegate from this morning's meeting. It passed with 19 votes in favor, 9 against, and 3 abstentions. 19 out of 31, more than I had projected. The sanctions motion against Earth was formally withdrawn by Breveth before it could come to a vote, on the grounds that the original complaint was under active review, and a sanctions vote before the review concluded would be procedurally premature. It was a technical maneuver, clean and unambiguous, and it told me that Breveth, who had been on the conclave for longer than some member species, had been spacefaring, had made a judgment about which way this was going. At the 14th hour, Solond formally announced that the Veth Dominion was suspending its participation in the current session pending a review of the procedural conduct of this body. It was diplomatic language for walking out, and it was a significant step. Withdrawing from a conclave session was not done casually. It had implications that would play out over the coming months, in ways I was already beginning to map. The chamber watched them leave. Solond and his delegation moved with composure, with the kind of practiced dignity that suggested they had prepared for this possibility. But the chamber was quiet as they went. And quiet in that specific way that means everyone is thinking the same thing and deciding how long to wait before saying it. After the Dominion delegation had cleared the doors, the Crescent delegate said, quietly but clearly enough to be heard by those around her, "They will be back." She paused, but not on the same terms. It was not a prediction. It was an observation from someone who had been in the room and had watched the ground shift under everyone's feet, including her own. I wrote it down. I filed my second report to Earth's Diplomatic Corps that evening. It was longer than the first. I included the Level 7 meeting notes in full. sanitized of identifying specifics that could compromise the delegates who had attended, but complete in terms of what had been offered and what had been agreed. I included my analysis of the audit vote margin. I included my read on the Dominion's withdrawal, and what I thought it signaled about their next move. I also included something that was not, strictly speaking, a diplomatic analysis. I wrote about Dresic, the technical verification officer who had stood in front of the chamber and explained, in the careful language of someone who respects the precision of facts, that the data had been there for 14 months. I wrote that I found it important to note, for the record, and for whoever would read this report in the Corps' archives at some future point, that the conclave had not failed because its charter was broken or its delegates were corrupt. It had failed in this case because no one had been asked to look at the pieces together. The monitoring stations had the data. The trade division had the complaint files. The security division had the incident reports. They were all in the system. They simply lived in different folders, attended to by different people who had no particular reason to run a cross-reference. That is a different kind of failure than malice. It is the failure of systems that grow large enough to stop seeing themselves as a whole. It is the failure of institutions that become comfortable with the process of handling information rather than the purpose of it. Earth had forced the cross-reference by walking into the chamber with the full picture in hand. That was the actual thing we had done, not the military action that had been the trigger, not the substance. The substance was that we had put all the pieces in the same room at the same time and pointed at them. It sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires someone to be willing to be in the room and to say the thing clearly and to keep saying it after the first wave of pushback and the second and the third. It requires a specific kind of patience, not the passive patience of waiting and hoping, but the active patience of knowing that the truth is true, regardless of whether the current audience is ready to accept it, and choosing to stay in the room anyway. Humans had a lot of practice with that kind of patience. We had several thousand years of historical evidence that this approach worked, eventually, and an equally extensive record of what happened when it was abandoned in favor of faster methods. We had earned our stubbornness. I sealed the report and sent it. On the third morning I had a conversation I had not planned for. I was in the station's common dining area, a vast, multi-environment space where the 31 species dietary requirements were accommodated in separate but adjacent sections, with a shared central seating space for those who wanted to use it. I had taken my meal to a table near one of the observation windows, partly for the view, and partly because I wanted to think without anyone trying to speak to me. The thinking lasted about 4 minutes before Brevith sat down across from me. Not an aide, not a junior counselor. Brevith himself, carrying what appeared to be a cup of something warm and moving with the deliberate economy of a being who had stopped rushing anywhere, approximately 3 centuries ago. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. "You are the presiding elder of the Galactic Conclave," I said. "I would not say so if you were." He made a sound that I was fairly certain was a quiet laugh. "I appreciate honesty in the morning. Most delegates are too careful before the 10th hour." "I am always careful," I said. "It just looks like honesty from the outside." He regarded me with those ancient eyes. "You planned this. From the beginning." "Earth planned the broad shape of it," I said. "The details developed in real time. The Level 7 meeting, I had expected this." Of course he knew about it. A presiding elder 400 years into the role did not operate without a thorough understanding of what was happening on his station. "Yes," I said. 7 delegates, he said. "More than I would have predicted given the composition of this session." "They are worried," I said. "Worried people are more willing to meet than comfortable ones." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. "I have been in this position for a very long time," he said. "I have seen species enter this conclave with great ambition and diminish over decades into bureaucratic habits. I have seen crises arrive slowly and be recognized too late. I have seen the charter fail the people it was meant to protect and survive through inertia rather than purpose." He paused. "I have not seen a first-year member nation restructure a session this completely. We had a significant disadvantage," I said. "We could not afford the luxury of the long game. Most species use the disadvantage to justify concession," he said. "Most species have more to fall back on," I said. "Earth is one planet. We do not have a long history in this part of space. We do not have political relationships built over centuries. We have 6 billion people on a rock and a few thousand more spread across colonies that apparently do not count for much when the appropriate authorities are filing queries." I looked at him directly. "When you do not have weight, you use the only thing that works regardless of weight, which is the true thing," I said clearly. "In the right room, At the right time. He held his cup and looked at me for a long moment. The review committee, he said. It will be difficult. The Dominion has allies who will slow it. The audit will be contested at every stage. Real change to Article 14 will take years, possibly a decade. I know, I said. Earth will not receive full satisfaction from this session. Earth did not come here for full satisfaction, I said. We came here to make it harder to look away. He considered that. He seemed to be weighing it against something. 400 years of institutional memory, maybe. All the sessions and verdicts and compromises and failures and slow-grinding reforms that he had presided over. Harder to look away, he repeated. That is usually enough to start with, I said. In our experience. He stood up, with the careful deliberateness of great age, and picked up his cup. Commander Dresch, he said, Earth is an unusual addition to this conclave. Thank you, I said. That was not entirely a compliment. I know. I said. Thank you anyway. He walked away. I turned back to the observation window. The stars did not look different, but the room behind me did. The formal session reconvened for its third and final day, with the Veth Dominion absent and a changed shape to everything. Breveth opened by reading a formal statement from the Dominion. They were suspending participation pending the audit, reserving all rights under charter protections, and formally objecting to the procedural handling of the intelligence data. It was careful, precise language designed to close as few doors as possible while still making the exit. Then the chamber turned to the remaining business, and the remaining business was substantial. The review committee was formally constituted with 7 members. Dorothi Delegate Marin was elected as chair by 8 votes to 3, with 4 abstentions. The Tarvan delegate from the morning meeting was appointed as deputy chair. The committee's mandate, as amended by the previous day's vote, included the fleet audit alongside the doctrine review. A secondary motion was introduced by the Mareth delegate, the one who had abstained twice the previous day rather than supporting the Dominion. The motion proposed a temporary conclave monitoring presence in the Kepler Reach, framed as a neutral security observation mission. I had not expected that. I had not expected it, and I had to work carefully to keep my expression from showing the degree to which I had not expected it. The Mreth had been listed in every briefing document Earth's intelligence division had prepared as firmly Dominion-aligned, not economically dependent, aligned, ideologically close, historically connected, with trade and cultural ties that went back over a century. And here was their delegate introducing a motion that would put conclave observers in the territory the Dominion had been slowly claiming. I thought about what that represented. Not a betrayal of the Dominion, the Mreth would not frame it that way, and would be insulted by the characterization. From their perspective, probably, it was a recalibration. The Dominion had been exposed. The method had been documented, and the documentation was now in the conclave's record permanently. Continuing to support the Dominion's position from here forward was not the same as it had been yesterday, because yesterday the support could have been argued as reasonable. Today it could not. The Mareth had done the calculation and moved. The monitoring motion passed with 22 votes in favor, the highest margin of the session. When Breveth formally closed the proceedings, there were no celebrations in the chamber. The conclave was not a place that celebrated. It was a place that processed and deliberated and concluded, and its emotional register was calibrated accordingly, measured and serious and aware of its own gravity. But as the delegates filed out, I noticed the kind of movement and exchange that does not appear in formal records. The brief conversations, the small gestures of acknowledgement, the delegates who stopped near my table as they passed rather than walking directly to the exit. Most of them said nothing. 1 or 2 offered formal words of procedural respect. The Voran delegate, who had not spoken once in the entire 3-day session, stopped directly in front of me, looked at me for approximately 4 seconds, and then continued on. I did not know exactly what that meant in Voran social terms. I was fairly confident it was positive. On the final evening before my transport departed, I walked the outer observation ring of Station Vareth 9 alone. It was a long corridor, curved to follow the station's outer hull, with panels of clear material that looked directly into space. The station was positioned at the edge of a star system, whose primary was a yellow dwarf not entirely unlike Earth's sun, and in the direction of the inner system there was a pale, warm light that caught the corridor's panels and made long shadows. I walked slowly, and I thought about what had happened over 3 days. The charges against Earth had not been dropped. They were suspended, technically, pending review. The review would run for months. There would be more sessions, more filings, more careful language exchanged across the respondents' table. The process was not over. The Veth Dominion had walked out, but they had not gone away. They were still powerful, still connected, still operating the fleet positions I had shown the chamber. The audit would not immediately change that. The review committee would not immediately change that. The monitoring mission would create a presence in the Reach, but presence was not the same as protection. There was still a great deal that could go wrong. I knew all of that. I carried it with the same steady awareness that you carry any heavy thing you have decided is worth carrying. And at the same time, underneath that awareness, running quiet and persistent like the sound of water, there was something else. 19 votes for the audit, 22 for the monitoring mission. A committee chair elected by 8 votes, in the 3rd year of Earth's conclave membership, for a committee that was going to rewrite the legal framework for how this body responded to the kind of harm that had been done to 42,000 people on Kepler-7. The Crescent delegate stepping off script, the Mareth delegate calculating and moving, the Voran delegate stopping to look at me for 4 seconds. Dresic, in her careful professional voice, saying, the data was in the system for 14 months. The ground had moved, not all the way, not to the place where it needed to eventually reach, but it had moved, and it had moved because Earth had walked into a room, alone, carrying nothing but facts and the willingness to say them clearly, and had refused to accept the version of the story that was convenient for everyone except the people being harmed by it. That was not a small thing. I leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the observation panel and looked at the stars for a long time. I was thinking about a place I had been when I was 8 years old, a trip my mother had taken me on in the summer, to a part of the coast where the water was green and cold, and the rocks were worn smooth by centuries of waves. She had told me something that day that I had not understood then and had spent the following 31 years slowly understanding. She had said, the water does not fight the rock. The water simply keeps moving, and eventually the rock is different because the water was there. I had asked her, how long does it take, she had said. Longer than you want it to, but the water never decides to stop. I had thought about that conversation many times over the course of my career. In rooms where the odds were wrong, in sessions where the process was slow, and the outcome was uncertain. And the people who needed things to change were waiting, somewhere else, for the people in the room to do their jobs. I thought about it now. I was tired. I was 39 years old and I had not slept enough in 3 days and my back ached and I had 3 months of follow-up filings ahead of me. And return transport leaving in 7 hours. And I was absolutely, completely certain of what I was going to do next. I was going to go back to my quarters and sleep for 6 hours. I was going to take the transport to the transfer station at Reach Junction, where I would connect to the Earth Direct line. I was going to file my final session report on the journey. I was going to arrive home and drink a cup of tea in my apartment and sit by the window for a little while and just be a person, briefly, before the next thing started. And then I was going to come back. Because the water does not decide to stop. I did not save the galaxy in 3 days on Station Vareth 9. I did not resolve the situation in the Kepler Reach or dismantle the Veth Dominions, ambitions or transform the Conclave into an institution that responded quickly and clearly, and without political hesitation to the harm done to its most vulnerable members. I made it harder to look away. For humanity, that is usually enough to start with. We have always known that the real work is not the dramatic moment. The real work is everything that comes after. The months of committee meetings, the filings and counterfilings, the slow rewriting of language in documents that most people will never read, the patient repetition of true things in rooms that are not yet ready to hear them. We are good at that work. We have had a long time to practice. We have centuries of evidence that institutions change, that laws shift, that the things that seem immovable from inside a single moment are not immovable across time. We have also centuries of evidence that none of that happens without someone being willing to walk into the room and say the true thing clearly, and then walk in again tomorrow and say it again. I pushed off from the observation panel and turned back toward the corridor. 7 hours until the transport, 6 hours of sleep, 3 months of filings, a decade of committee work, the beginning of something that would outlast this session and this station, and possibly me. I started walking,